In 1858, along the Ashley River just outside Charleston, South Carolina, a scandal erupted that would shatter one of the city's most prominent families and expose the grotesque moral corruption that slavery bred in the hearts of those who considered themselves civilized. Colonel Thaddeus Beaumont, a respected cotton planter and decorated veteran of the Mexican War, orchestrated an arrangement so depraved that even his fellow slaveholders, men who routinely brutalized human beings they claimed as property, recoiled in horror when whispers of it finally reached Charleston's drawing rooms. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South, stories that reveal how the institution of slavery corrupted not only the enslaved but the enslavers themselves, twisting human relationships into instruments of power, degradation, and ultimate destruction. The Beaumont plantation, known as Ashwood Hall, stretched across nearly 800 acres of some of the most fertile land in the South Carolina Low Country. 247 enslaved men, women, and children labored in its fields, producing the Sea Island cotton that made Colonel Beaumont one of Charleston's wealthiest citizens. The main house stood 3 stories tall, its white columns gleaming in the subtropical sun, surrounded by ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. From the veranda, one could see the orderly rows of whitewashed slave cabins, the cotton gin house, the stables, and beyond them, the endless fields that generated the family's fortune. Thaddeus Beaumont was 43 years old in 1858, a man of refined education, having studied at the College of Charleston and spent a year in Paris during his youth. He was known throughout the district for his intelligence, his collection of European art, his private library of over 3,000 volumes, and his seemingly progressive views on the management of enslaved people. He provided better rations than most planters, rarely used the whip himself, and allowed his slaves to maintain small garden plots and raise chickens. To Charleston society, he represented the ideal of the enlightened Southern gentleman, proof that slavery could be a civilizing force when administered by men of culture and refinement. His wife, Catherine Beaumont, was 28 years old, the daughter of a respected Savannah merchant family fallen on difficult times. She had married Thaddeus 5 years earlier, drawn by his wealth and status, but also by his reputation as a man of unusual sensitivity and learning. Catherine was a beautiful woman with pale skin, dark auburn hair, and gray-green eyes that reflected an intelligence her society told her to suppress. She had been educated at a finishing school in Richmond, spoke passable French, played the pianoforte with considerable skill, and read voraciously despite her husband's occasional disapproval of her choice of novels. But Catherine Beaumont harbored a secret that tormented her through 5 years of marriage. She had not conceived a child. In a society that measured a woman's worth primarily by her ability to produce heirs, particularly male heirs who would carry on the family name and inherit the plantation, Catherine's barrenness was becoming a source of whispered speculation among Charleston's elite. She had consulted physicians in Charleston, and as far away as Philadelphia, endured countless humiliating examinations, and submitted to various dubious treatments involving arsenic compounds and electrical stimulation, all to no avail. The shame ate at her daily, made worse by her husband's growing coldness and the knowing looks of other plantation wives who had produced broods of healthy children. Among Ashwood Hall's enslaved population, 5 men stood apart not by choice but by the attention Colonel Beaumont paid them. There was Solomon, 32 years old, the plantation's head blacksmith, a man of imposing physical strength with dark skin and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He had been born on the plantation, son of one of Thaddeus's father's most trusted slaves, and had been trained in metalworking from boyhood. There was Isaac, 26, the stable master, lighter skinned than Solomon, of mixed heritage himself, though he never spoke of his white father. Isaac had a gift with horses and a quiet dignity that even some of the white overseers grudgingly respected. There was Benjamin, 29, one of the carpenters, a man who could build anything from a cabin to a fine piece of furniture, his hands scarred from years of woodwork. There was Nathaniel, 24, who worked in the cotton gin house, youngest of the group, with a quick mind and an ability to repair the complex machinery that other slaves feared to touch. And finally, there was Elijah, 35, the oldest, a field hand of exceptional strength who had been purchased from a failing plantation in Georgia 3 years earlier, a man who kept his thoughts to himself and his eyes on the ground when white people passed. The winter of 1857 brought an early frost that damaged part of the cotton crop, and with it, increased tensions throughout the plantation. But inside the main house, a different kind of frost had settled over the marriage of Thaddeus and Catherine Beaumont. After yet another failed treatment, and another month without pregnancy, Thaddeus began to withdraw from his wife entirely, spending his evenings in his library, drinking French brandy and reading medical texts about heredity, bloodlines, and the supposed scientific basis for racial classifications. He became obsessed with the writings of Dr. Josiah Nott and other proponents of polygenesis, the theory that different races were actually separate species. In his increasingly disturbed mind, Thaddeus began to develop a theory that perhaps the problem with his marriage was not his wife's inability to conceive, but rather some deficiency in his own seed that might be overcome through unconventional means. He convinced himself that if Catherine could be bred, and he used that word in his private journals, which would later be discovered, with men of proven fertility and strength, she might finally carry a child to term, and he could claim that child as his own heir. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. How completely had slavery corrupted the moral imagination of the Southern planter class, that a man of education and culture could convince himself that breeding his own wife like livestock was a rational solution to childlessness. What does it tell us about a society that reduced human beings to property so thoroughly that even the most intimate human relationships could be reimagined as transactions of flesh and bloodlines? In March of 1858, Thaddeus Beaumont made a proposal to his wife that she would later describe in her own fragmentary writings as the moment her soul died. Behind the closed doors of his study, with the gaslights burning low and a fire crackling in the hearth, he explained his plan with the calm rationality of a man discussing crop rotation or livestock management. Catherine would submit to intimate relations with selected slaves of his choosing, men he had observed to be of superior physical constitution and proven fertility, as evidenced by their numerous offspring in the slave quarters. These encounters would be conducted in a controlled manner, on a schedule determined by her monthly cycles, in a specially prepared room of the house. Thaddeus himself would be present, he explained, to ensure that no emotional attachment formed, and to maintain the proper order of things. The slaves would be sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of being sold away from their families and sent to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate every slave in the South feared. Once Catherine conceived and bore a child, the arrangement would end. The slaves would receive small privileges, perhaps freedom for their own children in 10 or 15 years, and the Beaumont line would continue. He presented this monstrosity not as the violation it was, but as a solution both practical and grounded in his understanding of natural philosophy. Catherine Beaumont's response, as recorded in the letter she would later send to her sister in Savannah, oscillated between horror, despair, and a kind of numb resignation. She was trapped. Divorce was virtually impossible, and would leave her destitute and shamed. Returning to her family meant admitting failure and burdening her parents, who depended on the financial support Thaddeus provided. Refusing her husband meant continued isolation, possible commitment to an asylum. Husbands had such powers over wives in that era, and eventual abandonment. And beneath all her revulsion, there remained a desperate desire to fulfill what her society had taught her was woman's primary purpose: to bear children. In her darkest moment, Catherine Beaumont agreed to her husband's proposal, convincing herself that she was making a sacrifice for the sake of an innocent child who might yet be born, a child who would need a mother's protection in the twisted world into which it would arrive. The 5 slaves, Solomon, Isaac, Benjamin, Nathaniel, and Elijah, were summoned individually to the overseer's office in late March, and informed of what would be required of them. They were given no choice, of course. Slavery was the absence of choice. They were told that Mrs. Beaumont was ill, and required a special treatment that they would provide. They were told that absolute silence was required, that any slave who spoke of this to anyone else would be sold south immediately, along with his wife and children if he had them. They were told that cooperation would be rewarded with better rations, lighter work, and the possibility of eventual manumission for their offspring. The 5 men understood immediately the true nature of what was being asked of them, and each carried his own private burden of shame, rage, and helplessness. Solomon, who had a wife named Hannah and 3 children in the quarters, felt physically ill. Isaac, who had never married, understanding that any woman he loved could be sold away at any moment, felt a fury he had to bury deep inside himself or face certain death. Benjamin, Nathaniel, and Elijah each wrestled with their own demons, knowing that refusal meant not just their own suffering, but that of everyone they loved. The arrangement began in early April, during the week following Easter Sunday. Thaddeus had prepared a room on the 2nd floor of the main house, a space that had once been a guest bedroom, now furnished simply with a bed, a washstand, and heavy curtains that could be drawn to block out the spring sunlight. A schedule was established based on Catherine's cycle, calculated according to the medical theories of the time about fertility and conception. Each designated evening, one of the 5 men would be brought to the house through the back stairs, usually after dark, and escorted to the room where Catherine waited. Thaddeus would position himself in a chair in the corner, sometimes reading by lamplight, sometimes simply watching, maintaining what he saw as scientific observation and proper patriarchal authority over the proceedings. The slaves were instructed to be quiet, efficient, and to leave immediately afterward. Catherine was instructed to remain still for a period following each encounter, to maximize the chance of conception. What happened in that room over the following months was rape, though that word was not applied to the violation of enslaved people in the antebellum South, and it was the instrumentalization of Catherine herself, reduced to a vessel for her husband's obsessive need for an heir. The 5 enslaved men were rapists without choice, coerced into violation by a system that denied them humanity and threatened everything they held dear. Catherine was a victim who had given consent under duress so complete that the concept of choice became meaningless, and Thaddeus was the architect of it all, a monster who believed himself rational, a criminal who considered himself a man of science. The arrangement continued through April and into May, following the calculated schedule with mechanical precision. Sometimes Catherine wept silently during the encounters, sometimes the slaves wept afterward, in the darkness of their cabins, their wives and children sleeping nearby, the weight of what they had been forced to do crushing them. And Thaddeus kept meticulous records in his journal, noting dates, times, and observations, as if he were conducting a breeding experiment with livestock. If you are moved by these forgotten stories of the American South's darkest chapter, please subscribe to Shadows of the South to continue exploring the hidden histories that shaped our nation. These stories demand to be remembered, not for shock value, but because understanding the full horror of slavery is essential to understanding who we are today. By June of 1858, something had begun to shift in the atmosphere of Ashwood Hall. Secrets have a way of spreading no matter how tightly they are guarded, particularly on a plantation where enslaved people develop networks of information that no overseer can penetrate. Hannah, Solomon's wife, noticed changes in her husband's behavior, his nightmares, his reluctance to touch her, the shame in his eyes. The wives and family members of the other 4 men noticed similar changes. In the slave quarters, whispers began to circulate, fragmentary and confused at first, but gradually coalescing into a horrifying picture. The enslaved community understood that something terrible was happening in the main house, something involving their men and the mistress, something that the master himself was orchestrating. The knowledge spread like sickness through the quarters, creating a miasma of fear, disgust, and helpless rage. Some of the older enslaved women, who had survived decades of slavery's countless cruelties, recognized the arrangement for what it was, and understood with a terrible clarity that this was simply another manifestation of the complete power that masters held over both black and white bodies, another demonstration that slavery corrupted everything it touched. Meanwhile, in Charleston society, different whispers were beginning to circulate. The Beaumonts had become increasingly isolated, declining invitations to dinners and balls, attending church irregularly. Catherine appeared pale and drawn on the few occasions when she did venture into town. Some Charleston matrons, with their finely tuned sensitivity to scandal, began to speculate that something was wrong at Ashwood Hall. Henrietta Middleton, wife of Judge Cornelius Middleton, and the unofficial arbiter of Charleston society, remarked to several friends that Catherine Beaumont had the look of a woman carrying a terrible secret. Dr. Samuel Rutledge, the Beaumonts' family physician, had been consulted by Thaddeus on several occasions about theories of fertility and bloodlines, and while the colonel had been careful not to reveal his actual plan, the doctor had heard enough to feel vaguely disturbed, though he could not quite articulate why. Consider this: in a society built on the violent subjugation of millions of human beings, what level of additional transgression was required to shock those who already tolerated daily horrors? The elite of Charleston bought and sold human beings at auction, separated mothers from children, and used the whip to enforce their will, yet even they would be horrified by what was happening at Ashwood Hall. What does that tell us about the particular nature of Thaddeus Beaumont's crime? In late June, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. Dr. Rutledge confirmed it during a visit to the plantation in early July, and the news should have brought joy. Instead, Catherine felt only a profound emptiness and a desperate hope that this meant the arrangement would end as promised. Thaddeus was initially elated, convinced that his experiment had succeeded, that his unconventional approach to ensuring an heir had been vindicated. He ended the arrangement immediately, ordering the 5 slaves to return to their normal duties and impressing upon them once again the necessity of eternal silence. He became almost solicitous toward Catherine, ensuring she had the finest foods, the best medical attention, and complete rest. But beneath his satisfaction lurked a growing anxiety about the child's paternity and the question of whether its appearance might reveal the truth of its origins. The 5 enslaved men tried to return to their lives, but the damage had been done. Solomon found himself unable to be intimate with Hannah, the trauma of what he had been forced to do, creating a barrier he could not cross. Isaac became withdrawn, and began to speak of escape, dangerous talk that could get a slave killed. Benjamin threw himself into his carpentry work with manic intensity, building things late into the night to avoid sleep and the nightmares that came with it. Nathaniel began to show signs of what we would now recognize as severe depression, moving through his days like a ghost, and Elijah, the field hand, began to exhibit flashes of rage that worried the overseers. Sudden moments, when the mask of submission would slip, and something murderous would show in his eyes before he could suppress it again. As Catherine's pregnancy progressed through the summer and into the fall, the whispers in both the slave quarters and Charleston society grew louder. In the quarters, more people had pieced together the truth, and a collective horror settled over the enslaved community. Some of the older slaves, particularly the women, began to treat Catherine with a strange mixture of pity and disgust, recognizing her as both complicit in the arrangement and victim of it, trapped in a system that degraded everyone it touched. In Charleston, the Beaumonts' continued isolation and Catherine's obvious pregnancy prompted more speculation. Mrs. Middleton remarked at a tea party that it was curious how Catherine had conceived after 5 years of barrenness, and perhaps the low country air disagreed with the colonel, and a stay in Charleston might have been beneficial. And wasn't it interesting how the Beaumonts had withdrawn from society just before the pregnancy was confirmed? The comment, delivered with a knowing look, set other tongues wagging. The first real crack in the secrecy came in October, during the harvest season. Isaac, the stable master, disappeared one night. He had told no one of his plans, but several slaves had heard him talking about escape in the weeks prior, and it was assumed he had fled north. Thaddeus was furious, and sent out patrols and hired slave catchers, but Isaac had vanished completely. What the Beaumonts did not know was that Isaac had reached a free black community in the north, and consumed by rage and trauma, had begun to tell his story to abolitionists. His account, fragmentary and difficult to verify, would eventually make its way into abolitionist newspapers, though carefully edited to protect the identity of the enslaved people still trapped at Ashwood Hall. In November, a Presbyterian minister named Reverend Thomas Whitfield came to call at Ashwood Hall. Reverend Whitfield was an older man, respected throughout the district, known for his stern morality and his increasingly complicated relationship with slavery. He considered it a necessary evil at best, a curse on the South at worst, though he never spoke such thoughts publicly. He had heard rumors, fragments of stories, whispers that had reached him through his work, visiting various plantations in the parish. He came to counsel the Beaumonts on spiritual matters, and to inquire after their welfare. Thaddeus received him cordially enough, but the minister noted the tension in the house, the way servants moved quietly and kept their eyes down, the exhausted look on Catherine's face, now 7 months pregnant. In his conversation with the couple, Reverend Whitfield made several oblique references to sin, secrecy, and the judgment of God, watching their reactions carefully. What he saw disturbed him deeply, though he had no concrete proof of any wrongdoing. He left Ashwood Hall with a heavy heart and a growing conviction that something profoundly wrong had occurred under that roof. In a world where slavery was legal and sanctioned by both church and state, what moral authority could anyone claim when trying to condemn a particular act of cruelty? Reverend Whitfield, like so many clergymen of his era, had to wrestle with the fundamental contradiction of his position. How could he preach about human dignity and divine judgment while accepting a system that denied the humanity of millions? The tragedy of the moderate in an immoral system is that his moderacy itself becomes complicity. December brought cold winds across the low country, unusual frost, and a sense of impending doom that hung over Ashwood Hall, like the gray Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks. Catherine went into labor on December 23, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Dr. Rutledge was summoned, and arrived to find Catherine in severe distress. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into Christmas Eve day. The enslaved house servants could hear her screams, and many of them prayed for her, for the innocent child being born, for all of them trapped in this damned place. The baby, a boy, was finally born just before dawn on Christmas Eve. He was healthy, strong-lunged, and his appearance would doom the Beaumont family. The child was unmistakably of mixed race. His skin tone was somewhere between his mother's pale complexion and a light brown. His features showed clear African ancestry, and his hair had a tight curl that no amount of wishful thinking could attribute to some distant Mediterranean ancestor in the Beaumont family tree. Dr. Rutledge, holding the infant, looked from the baby to Catherine's exhausted face, to Thaddeus's expression of horror, and understood immediately that some terrible transgression had occurred. Catherine began to weep uncontrollably. Thaddeus stood frozen, his entire elaborate plan collapsing around him. He had imagined that the child would look sufficiently white to pass, that any mixed ancestry might be attributed to rumored drops of African blood that supposedly existed in many Southern families. But this child's appearance was undeniable proof of his recent black ancestry. Dr. Rutledge, a man of professional discretion, but also genuine moral conviction, excused himself and left the house after ensuring Catherine was stable. He did not speak openly of what he had witnessed, but his silence itself was eloquent. Within days, through the invisible networks that carry scandal through small communities, Charleston society knew that Catherine Beaumont had given birth to a mixed-race child. The response was explosive. In a society obsessed with racial purity, where even the rumor of black ancestry could destroy a family's social standing, the Beaumonts became immediate pariahs. The speculation about how this could have happened
was immediate and fevered. Some assumed Catherine had carried on an affair with a slave, which would make her an adulteress, and worse. Others whispered that perhaps Thaddeus himself had black ancestry that he had hidden. The truth, when fragments of it began to emerge through the testimony of enslaved people who could no longer maintain complete silence, was so bizarre and disturbing that many refused to believe it at first. Reverend Whitfield, hearing the news and combining it with his own observations and the whispers he had heard, decided he had a moral obligation to investigate. He interviewed several enslaved people from Ashwood Hall, promising them protection and speaking to them privately away from the plantation. Through these careful conversations, conducted in late December and early January, he pieced together the truth. What he learned horrified him so completely that he spent 3 days in prayer, trying to understand how to respond to such depravity. In mid-January, he went to Judge Middleton, a man he trusted, and presented what he had learned. The enslaved men who were forced to participate in his scheme were victims twice over, first enslaved, then coerced into acts that violated others and themselves. They lived the rest of their lives with the trauma of what they had been forced to do, with the knowledge that they had been used as instruments of violation, with the helpless rage of being stripped of even the possibility of moral choice. Their wives and families lived with the knowledge of what had happened, and with the reality that under slavery, such things could happen at any moment to anyone. Catherine Beaumont was both victim and participant, trapped in a marriage and a society that gave her no power, no choice, no escape, yet complicit in the horror, through her desperate desire to fulfill the role her society had assigned her. And Thomas, the child, was the most innocent victim of all, born into a world that would reject him simply for existing, carrying in his very body the evidence of slavery's corruption. These stories from the shadows of the American South reveal truths that are painful to confront but necessary to remember. The scandal at Ashwood Hall was not an aberration, not an isolated case of one man's individual depravity, but rather a particularly vivid illustration of what slavery made possible. It was a system that gave some human beings absolute power over others, that reduced people to property, that destroyed the possibility of moral relationships by turning everything, work, family, even intimacy, into questions of ownership and control. The horror of Thaddeus Beaumont's actions lies not just in their particular cruelty, but in how completely they embodied the logic of slavery itself, the idea that human beings could be bred, used, and discarded according to the will of their owners, the idea that power over others' bodies was a form of property right, the idea that the enslaver's desires, whether for profit, pleasure, or progeny, took precedence over the humanity of the enslaved. The South, after the Civil War, worked hard to forget stories like this one, to construct a mythology of benevolent masters and contented slaves, of a gracious civilization destroyed by Northern aggression. But the truth was always more complex and far darker. The Ameris Indorus Tem. Self. Whatsetri self. Slavery was a system of violence, exploitation, and degradation that destroyed millions of lives and corrupted the souls of those who participated in it, whether as perpetrators, victims, or silent witnesses. The legacy of that system continues to shape American society today, in our racial divisions, our economic inequalities, our ongoing struggles to create a truly just society. We cannot move forward without understanding where we have been, without confronting the full horror of our history, without acknowledging that the beautiful plantations tourists visit today were sites of profound human suffering, and that behind every columned mansion was a system of bondage that reduced human beings to property. The story of Ashwood Hall asks us to remember not just the famous abolitionists and the dramatic battles of the Civil War, but the countless individuals, enslaved people, whose names we will never know, women like Catherine trapped in impossible circumstances, children, like Thomas born into a world that had no place for them, who lived and suffered, and tried to maintain their humanity within a system designed to destroy it. Their stories matter, their pain matters, and their legacy calls us to build a society that recognizes the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, that rejects all forms of degradation and exploitation, that refuses to forget what we have done, so that we might, finally, become what we claim to be, a nation founded on the principle that all people are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. May we learn from the shadows of our past, so that we can walk more faithfully toward the light of a more just future.